I swear, the moment I opened the door that night, something in the air felt wrong. Heavy, stale, almost like the house itself was holding its breath. I'd just gotten off a brutal shift at work, my shoulders aching, my mind buzzing with nothing but the thought of taking off my shoes. But there they were, sitting at my dining table like it belonged to them. Ethan looked straight at me, blank-faced, and that woman, his woman, didn't even bother pretending she felt out of place. It was like I'd walked into their home instead of mine. Ethan pushed a stack of papers toward me with the tip of a pen, as if he couldn't be bothered to actually hand them over. He said I should sign peacefully, and that if I didn't, he'd find another way to make me sign. I remember standing there thinking, is this really happening? My brain couldn't catch up. Then I saw the papers, terms so cruel, so lopsided, they might as well have been written by someone who hated me. And the mistress? God. She didn't even hide her little smirk. My hands started shaking, but not from fear, more from disbelief at how boldly stupid they both were. They actually thought I'd sign away everything without a fight. They actually thought I'd walk out of that house empty-handed and ashamed. So I grabbed the nearest thing I could reach, a glass of water, and threw it right in Ethan's face. The splash echoed through the room like punctuation. And then I walked out. No screaming, no begging, no explanations, just silence. Because deep down, I knew something they clearly didn't. I had far more power than they ever imagined. When I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap, sharp enough to make me breathe again. I remember gripping the railing of the porch just to steady myself, feeling my pulse thudding in my ears. It wasn't sadness. Not yet. It was this strange mix of shock and clarity, like someone had switched on a light in a room I'd been stumbling through for years. I kept replaying the scene in my head, Ethan's flat voice, the mistress's smug face, those ridiculous papers. It felt surreal, almost laughable. I walked to my car on autopilot, my heels clicking against the pavement like they were keeping time with my thoughts. I didn't even bother grabbing my purse. I realized halfway down the street that I'd left it inside. But honestly, I didn't care. I didn't want a single thing from that house in that moment. Not one object that had been tainted by the presence of those two sitting in my kitchen like they owned my life. All I wanted was distance, space to breathe, space to think, space to feel the anger rising from somewhere deep in my chest. I sat in the driver's seat for a long minute before turning the car on, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My eyes looked different, sharper, almost like they belonged to someone who'd just woken up from a very long sleep. And I knew that Ethan and his mistress had absolutely no idea what they'd just unleashed, because while they were busy plotting how to get rid of me quietly, they forgot one very important detail. I've always known more than they thought. More than Ethan ever imagined I'd dare to use. As I finally pulled out of the driveway, I caught a glimpse of the house in the rearview mirror, lights still on, silhouettes shifting behind the curtains. For a second, the weight of the years I'd spent there pressed down on me, all the memories, the laughter, the stupid dreams we'd once shared. But then the image of him sliding those papers across the table, like he was doing me a favor, burned the sentimentality right out of me. Whatever that house used to represent, it didn't anymore. Not after tonight. While I drove, my mind drifted to all the secrets I'd kept for Ethan over the years. The little mistakes at work he brushed off as harmless. The creative accounting he said everyone did. The late-night calls he claimed were just clients, but never let me overhear. I'd let it slide, telling myself it wasn't my business, that relationships required trust. But the truth is, I'd protected him more times than I could count, protected him from consequences he absolutely deserved. And now he thought he could corner me with some trash divorce papers? Oh, he really didn't know me at all. By the time I reached the main road, something inside me had shifted. I wasn't trembling anymore. I wasn't confused. I wasn't broken. I felt awake, alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't the end. Far from it. If anything, this was the beginning of a version of me I'd forgotten I could be. And I knew exactly who I needed to see next. The one person who always told me I was stronger than the life I'd settled for. The person who would help me make sense of the fire now burning in my chest. I drove straight to my sister Emily's house because, honestly, she was the only person I could trust to see me in that state, half shaking, half furious, and nowhere near ready to explain what had just happened. When she opened the door, she didn't even ask a question at first. She just looked at my face, stepped aside, and said, "Come in." And that tiny gesture, no judgment, no pressure, nearly cracked me open. The warmth of her house, the faint smell of vanilla candles, the low hum of the TV. It all felt so painfully safe compared to the hell I'd just walked out of. I sat on her couch, breathing in these slow, uneven breaths, while she waited patiently across from me, hands folded like she was afraid to touch the anger radiating off my skin. When I finally told her what I'd walked into, Ethan sitting at my table, divorce papers scattered like confetti, the mistress perched beside him like a proud little trophy, Emily's jaw dropped. She said he'd lost what was left of his mind, and she kept repeating it, louder each time, like the words might somehow make it make sense. But nothing made sense. Not yet. When I told her about the terms of the divorce, how he said I should sign peacefully or the hard way, Emily actually stood up as if she were ready to march back to my house that very second and drag him out by the ear. And for a moment, I wished she would. But then another feeling crept in, something calmer, colder, almost surgical. I told her no, because I needed to think. I needed to remember every detail Ethan assumed I'd forgotten, every account, every lie, every crumb of leverage I'd quietly collected without even realizing it. And as I spoke, I felt Emily's expression shift, not just outrage anymore, but recognition. She saw the old me waking back up. Emily brought me a blanket and a cup of tea, chamomile, the one she always made when life got too loud, while I stared at the floor, replaying years of little moments I'd brushed aside. I remembered late nights when Ethan came home smelling like a perfume I didn't own, and how he'd say I was imagining things. I remembered the weird bank notifications he always rushed to delete, and how he insisted I didn't need to worry about money. Back then, I chalked it up to stress, to marriage being complicated, to me being too sensitive. But now all those moments clicked together like pieces of a puzzle I'd been too tired to finish. "Liv, you know this isn't just about cheating," Emily said quietly, sitting next to me. And she was right. God, she was so right. It wasn't the affair that cut the deepest. It was the arrogance. The way he'd looked at me tonight, like I was some obstacle to be removed, not a woman who held a decade of his secrets in the palm of her hand. And there were things I knew, things even his precious mistress didn't. Every reckless misstep, every shady investment, every time he'd laugh and say, "Don't worry about it, babe, it's just business." I'd protected him without realizing the power I was handing over. Emily put her hand on mine, this soft, grounding gesture that made my throat tighten. She told me I didn't have to rush into anything, but her eyes were already scanning me like she could see the gears turning inside my head. And she wasn't wrong. Something was crystallizing inside me. An understanding that Ethan thought he'd cornered me when, in reality, he'd backed himself into the smallest, darkest corner imaginable. I wasn't scared of him, not anymore. I was furious. And beneath that fury, a new kind of clarity was beginning to bloom. After a while, I asked Emily if she still had the box, my box, the one I'd left with her years ago, just in case. She blinked for a moment, then nodded slowly, like she was only just now realizing why I'd kept it with her instead of at home. When she brought it out from the top of her closet, dust settling around it like a tiny storm, I felt this strange surge of vindication. That box held copies of documents Ethan never knew I'd seen, screenshots of messages he thought he'd deleted, and notes I'd made when his stories started sounding too rehearsed. Back then, I'd saved them because something felt off. Tonight, I finally understood why. I sifted through everything on her living room floor, papers spread like a quiet battlefield. Emily kept pacing, muttering things like, "I knew that jerk was up to something," and "he really thought he could play you like that." But I barely heard her. My mind was somewhere else, connecting dots I should have connected long ago. There were emails to names I didn't recognize, unexplained withdrawals, investments that didn't line up with our income, and dates that overlapped with the nights he swore he was working late. Every page made my stomach twist, but not from heartbreak, from clarity. By the time the clock hit midnight, I felt the exhaustion settle deep into my bones, but I also felt ready. Ready in a way I hadn't felt in years. I closed the box, knowing exactly who I needed to call next. Marianne. The one lawyer Ethan always said was too aggressive, which now sounded like exactly what I needed. I wasn't walking into this blind anymore. I was armed, steady, and finally willing to see Ethan for who he really was. And as I turned off the lights and settled onto Emily's couch, one final thought echoed in my mind. He has no idea what's coming. The next morning, I woke up on Emily's couch with that heavy, buzzing awareness you get after a night that changes everything. My neck was stiff, my hair a mess, but my mind, sharp, focused. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found Marianne's name, the lawyer Ethan always avoided because she made mountains out of molehills. Funny, considering the mountain he'd tried to drop on me last night. I hesitated only a second before calling her, and when she picked up, her voice warm but alert, I knew I'd made the right choice. I told her I needed an urgent appointment, and she didn't pry over the phone, just told me to come by her office in an hour. When I walked into the lobby, the smell of strong coffee and printer ink hit me, grounding me instantly. Marianne stepped out of her office the moment she heard I'd arrived, eyebrows rising when she saw my face. She ushered me in with this firm, protective energy, like she already suspected the kind of storm I was bringing with me. She sat across from me, folded her hands, and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the scene at the table, the divorce papers, the threat Ethan made, the mistress sitting beside him like some smug little supervisor. Marianne's expression shifted from disbelief to irritation to something colder, professional, calculating fury. When I pulled the papers from my bag and handed them to her, she scanned them quickly, then looked up and said, "Olivia, these aren't just unfair, they're illegal. He can't force you to sign this." I felt my breath hitch, relief mixing with something darker. Because if Ethan thought he could bulldoze me, he was about to learn what a real bulldozer looked like. Marianne asked if I had anything else that might be relevant, and that was when I placed the box on her desk. She lifted the lid slowly, almost ceremonially, and when she saw the folders, the screenshots, the bank statements, her whole posture changed. She went from lawyer to predator in a heartbeat. She started sorting through everything with quick, precise movements, her eyes narrowing each time she connected one thread to another. When she found the emails to the offshore account, she let out a low whistle and said, "He really thought you wouldn't notice this." I told her everything, how I'd suspected things for years but talked myself out of confronting them, how Ethan always dismissed my intuition, how he'd say things like, "You're overthinking again," or "You're not good with numbers." Marianne actually scoffed at that, saying it was textbook manipulation. She explained that what I had, the proof of tax evasion, shady investments, undeclared income, wasn't just leverage. It was a loaded weapon, a legal one that could tear Ethan's whole facade to pieces with a single motion. Hearing her say it out loud made something inside me settle, like puzzle pieces finally locking into place. Marianne leaned back, tapping a pen against the desk as if weighing the scale of his stupidity. Then she looked me dead in the eye and said, "Olivia, you're not the one trapped here. He is." And that sentence, God, it hit hard. For years, Ethan made me feel small, dependent, lucky to have him. But sitting there in that office with proof of his lies spread like a map of his downfall, I realized the truth. He'd built his power on the assumption that I'd never fight back. He'd mistaken my loyalty for weakness. And now I finally understood the difference. Marianne started drafting a new set of divorce terms right there in front of me. Clean, fair, and nothing like the garbage Ethan had slapped on the table the night before. She said we'd send them to him formally, but first, she wanted to make sure I understood just how strong my position really was. She explained the laws, the penalties, the way judges reacted to hidden accounts and coercion. And with every word, I felt this warmth growing in my chest. Not comfort, not exactly. More like recognition, like finally seeing my reflection without the fog he'd spent years placing over it. Just when we were finishing up, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. But the moment I opened it, my stomach tightened. It was her, the mistress, the nerve of that woman. She told me I should sign quickly before things got embarrassing, as if she was doing me some kind of twisted favor. She even added a winking emoji at the end, like this was some kind of game she assumed she'd already won. Marianne leaned over to read it, and the look on her face, priceless. A mix of disgust and amusement, like she couldn't believe the stupidity on display. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Because while she was busy trying to intimidate me with empty threats, Marianne was sitting right beside me drafting the paperwork that could destroy Ethan's reputation, his finances, and whatever fantasy future the two of them had cooked up. I slipped my phone back into my bag, feeling something settle deep inside me, calm, controlled, almost cold. They wanted a fight. They thought they'd cornered me. But they had no idea that I'd just stepped into the one arena where Ethan couldn't lie, smooth talk, or bully his way out. And this time, I wasn't walking alone. A few days later, Marianne told me it was time. Time to deliver the revised divorce papers face-to-face, with her present, calm, professional, impossible to intimidate. I agreed without hesitation. I wanted Ethan to look at me and understand exactly what he'd triggered. When we pulled up to the cafe where he'd insisted on meeting, my heart was steady, almost eerily so. The place was busy enough to feel neutral, public enough that he couldn't pull any stunts. I walked in first, and there he was, sitting at a corner table. Alone. No mistress clinging to his arm this time. The moment he saw me, his expression faltered. Just a flicker, but I caught it. Like he expected me to show up broken, begging, humiliated. Instead, I sat down across from him with the kind of composure I'd forgotten I was capable of. He cleared his throat and said he hoped I'd come to my senses, as if I were the unstable one. Marianne placed the new documents on the table with a quiet, deliberate motion. Ethan's eyes widened the moment he saw the letterhead, the legal terminology, the formal accusations waiting to be filed if he refused to negotiate. He skimmed the pages, color draining from his face with every line. He muttered that I was blowing things out of proportion, and then, incredibly, he accused me of trying to ruin his life. I almost laughed. Ruin his life? The man had tried to bulldoze mine 3 nights ago. Marianne stayed firm, reminding him that coercion, hidden accounts, and financial manipulation were not only grounds for forfeiture, they were crimes. He kept glancing around the cafe, probably terrified someone would overhear. Funny, considering he'd been perfectly fine humiliating me in my own home. Before Ethan could finish sputtering excuses, she appeared, the mistress, hovering near the entrance like she wasn't sure whether to join him or run. Her eyes darted between us, and when she finally approached the table, she had that same smug tilt to her chin, until she noticed Marianne. Then her confidence cracked just a little. She whispered something to Ethan, something sharp, urgent, but he waved her off, snapping that he had things under control. The irony nearly made me smile. He didn't have a single thing under control, and for the first time, he knew it. When she turned to me, she tried to put on this faux sweet tone, saying she hoped I wasn't making this harder than it needed to be. And hearing that, after everything they'd put me through, my hands didn't shake. My voice didn't rise. I just looked at her the way you look at someone who doesn't realize they've walked into traffic. Marianne slid another document out of her folder, outlining the financial risks Ethan now faced. The mistress leaned over to read it, and I swear I watched the exact moment the blood drained from her face. Her perfect little world was cracking. Ethan hissed at her to stay quiet so he could think, but she wasn't having it. She demanded to know why there were secret accounts, hidden investments, transactions she clearly had no idea about. And suddenly they were bickering, right there in the middle of the cafe, accusing each other, defending themselves, unraveling at the seams. I sat back, letting their chaos swirl. Marianne didn't interrupt, she just waited, letting them expose themselves. And in that moment, watching them implode, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet, steady sense of justice I'd been craving for far too long. Eventually, Ethan tried to pull himself together, pinching the bridge of his nose like we were the ones overwhelming him. He looked at me with this desperate, brittle kind of frustration and said I was making things complicated, that I should have just signed the papers quietly to avoid all this. Hearing him talk like I was the problem, like he hadn't detonated our marriage with his arrogance, filled me with a calm I can't explain. I told him, in the same steady tone you use on a child, that the only complicated thing here was the web of lies he'd woven around himself. Marianne leaned in, her voice low but razor-sharp, reminding him that the revised terms were the best outcome he could hope for. Cooperation meant peace. Refusal meant investigations, audits, and charges that would outlive the affair he'd ruined his life for. His mistress stared at him like she was seeing him for the first time, really seeing him. The fear in her eyes wasn't for me. It was because she suddenly realized the man she'd gambled her future on was nothing but a walking liability, a sinking ship, and she'd already climbed aboard without checking the holes in the hull. When Ethan finally lifted the papers again, I could see the tremor in his hands. He wasn't angry anymore. He was scared. Scared of me. Scared of Marianne. Scared of the truth he'd spent years hiding behind bravado and manipulation. And for the first time, I felt nothing for him. Not love, not hatred, not even pity, just distance, a clean, sharp separation between who I used to be and who I was becoming. I stood up, smoothing my coat, and told him we'd expect his signature by the end of the week. Then I walked out of that cafe, leaving the two of them drowning in their own mess. The signature came 2 days later. No fight, no theatrics, just a quiet email from his lawyer confirming he'd accepted every single term. When Marianne forwarded it to me, I sat there staring at the screen, waiting for some kind of wave to hit me. Relief, maybe. Fury. Grief. But instead, I felt this deep, steady exhale inside my chest, like I'd finally released a breath I'd been holding for years. Emily hugged me from behind, whispering that she was proud of me, proud that I'd stood up for myself in a way I didn't even know I was capable of anymore. The mistress vanished right after that, completely. One moment she was hovering around Ethan like a shadow with lipstick, and the next she'd scrubbed her social media, moved out of her apartment, and blocked him on everything. Marianne told me it was predictable. People like her run fast when the fantasy collapses. And Ethan? He tried calling me 3 times that week. The first time, I let it ring. The second, I declined. The third, he left a voice message saying I had misunderstood the situation, that he'd been confused and pressured. Hearing his voice twist the truth didn't hurt. It annoyed me, like listening to an old song I'd finally outgrown. Instead of replying, I focused on myself for the first time in so long it felt unfamiliar. I found a small apartment near the lake. Nothing fancy, but it had big windows and morning light, and it didn't hold a single trace of Ethan's scent. I bought a new set of dishes, soft towels, candles that smelled like eucalyptus and clean air, and every little thing I placed in that apartment felt like staking a flag in my own territory again. A space that belonged entirely to me, a space he had never touched. And God, that alone felt like a victory. I spent the next few days settling into my new life in these small, almost tender motions. I'd wake up with sunlight warming my face instead of tension knotting my stomach. I'd make coffee in silence, real silence, not the suffocating quiet that used to fill our old kitchen whenever Ethan was in a foul mood. I even caught myself humming while organizing my closet, this simple domestic joy I hadn't felt in years. And it was in those small moments that I realized something important. I wasn't just moving on from him. I was rediscovering parts of myself he'd buried without me noticing. Emily came by with a bottle of wine and insisted we christen the new place, as she called it. We sat on the floor eating takeout from the containers, and she asked if I'd told anyone else what happened. I shook my head. Not because I was hiding anything, but because I didn't need validation anymore. I wasn't looking for sympathy or outrage or advice. I had faced the worst of it already, and I'd walked out stronger. Emily smiled and said she could see it in my posture, in my voice, like I had shed a skin I'd been dragging around for years. And honestly, she was right. That night, after she left, I stood by the window watching the city lights flicker below me. My reflection in the glass looked different, softer, but somehow more defined. I thought about everything that had happened: the betrayal, the humiliation, the confrontation, the victory. And instead of replaying the pain, my mind drifted to something else entirely: possibility. The kind of future that wasn't determined by someone else's moods or demands. A life built on my terms, with my boundaries, my dreams, my peace. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't scare me. It called to me. A week after the divorce was finalized, Ethan sent one last email, long, rambling, full of excuses dressed up as self-reflection. He wrote that he never meant to hurt me, that he'd been going through a difficult time, that he hoped we could still talk someday. I read it once, slowly, letting each word roll over me like lukewarm water. There was a time when messages like that would have pulled me right back in, made me doubt myself, made me bend, made me consider forgiving what should never have been forgiven. But now, it felt like reading a stranger's apology for someone else's crime. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. There was nothing to salvage, no thread to pull, no memory strong enough to justify reopening a door I'd finally closed. Instead, I drafted a letter to myself. Not to send, not to show anyone, just to write down the truth of who I had become. I wrote about the woman who walked out of her own house with nothing but her car keys and her dignity. I wrote about the anger that sharpened me instead of destroying me. I wrote about the moment I finally remembered my worth, not because someone reminded me, but because I reclaimed it. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer beside my bed. A small, quiet promise to never forget this version of me again. And as I lay down that night, the sheets cool against my skin, I felt that unmistakable sense of peace, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone else's choices, the kind that doesn't disappear when life shifts, the kind that grows from the ashes of everything that tried to break you. I closed my eyes knowing this chapter of my life was truly over, and something entirely new was waiting on the other side. Months later, when I look back on everything, it feels almost unreal. As if the woman who walked into that dining room and saw her husband with another woman belongs to a different lifetime. Sometimes I try to remember the exact moment the pain shifted into resolve, but it wasn't a single moment. It was the slow, steady gathering of every time I'd swallowed my voice, every lie he told, every instinct I ignored. Betrayal didn't break me the way I once feared it would. It cleared the fog. It showed me where I'd been shrinking to make room for someone who never once made room for me. People ask how I stayed so calm through it all, how I didn't scream or throw things or burn his world to the ground. But the truth is, I didn't need fire. The truth was louder than flames. The truth did the work for me. His business partners pulled away. His spotless reputation cracked. The hidden accounts he thought made him clever became the rope tightening around his own neck. And while everyone whispered about his downfall, I simply moved forward, quietly, steadily, rebuilding a life he no longer had the power to touch. Revenge, I realized, isn't about destruction. Not really. It's about reclamation. Taking back the parts of yourself you gave to someone who never deserved them. My revenge wasn't the settlement or the frozen accounts or the mistress disappearing from his life. My revenge was waking up every morning in a home filled with peace instead of fear. It was choosing myself without hesitation. It was looking in the mirror and recognizing the woman staring back. And maybe one day, when he's sitting alone with nothing but his regrets, he'll finally understand the quiet truth I learned. The hardest revenge to endure is watching the person you tried to break become someone you never had the strength to be.